Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's C-O-M-B-E-S-T, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?
It's me, Egbert, once again. I'm the new owner of this station. I went out and hired the best talk radio consultant, Jeff Allen from News Talk STL, and told him to hire the worst talent he could find. Jeff did exactly as I told him. Ladies and gentlemen, here are Brad and John.
Okay, John, are you ready for me to go really nerdy?
Oh, yeah, and I'm ready to reel you back in if we exceed the level of nerdiness.
Okay, once upon a time, and not to brag, well, I'm going to just be like Mike Carter. I've got a journalism master's degree, which is useless. Every time I hear his commercial, I've got a master's degree in journalism, I'm thinking to myself, dude, if you just had that, you'd be broke. You wouldn't be a rich attorney.
True.
But that's a whole nother story. Okay, once upon a time, I enrolled at Mississippi State to get my meteorology degree.
I've never heard this story, Brad, for real.
Yes, I enrolled at Mississippi State to get my meteorology degree, and quite honestly, I got through the first couple semesters and I dropped out. There's a whole reason behind that. My life sort of changed. The way my life was structured took a left turn and I had to drop out. Okay, I've always been a meteorology nerd, and I will tell you a weird, strange story that one of my teachers in Kirby Junior High, at the time she was a student teacher and ultimately became a full-fledged teacher. Her name was Connie Waldheiser, okay? And she's now married and been married for a long time. I still have a crush on her. I mean, still an incredible crush on, and her name is, I think, Connie Guido. And she married a dentist, and they're both retired now. Okay.
Well, she married an Italian, is what you're saying.
Yes, an Italian dentist. Okay. But when she was working at Kirby Junior High, I was enamored with her because I thought she was super attractive, and she was a cool teacher, and I really liked her. But her father was Bill Waldheiser, and this is really going back to the old school days. And Bill Waldheiser was on KMOX all the time because at the time, Bill Waldheiser was the chief meteorologist for NOAA. Back in the old days, it was called NWA, the National Weather Service. Now it's NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, if I can spit that out, okay? So I was fascinated with meteorology as a kid, and to this day, I still am. And when I, took my pilot's license, all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of meteorology in become a pilot. You have to learn all sorts of crazy stuff, density, altitude, and some really complicated theories. Density, altitude is probably one of the most fascinating things about aviation, which a lot of people don't understand. And unfortunately, even some pilots don't necessarily totally understand it.
All right.
So anyway, I became a weather nerd, and to this day, I still am a weather nerd. I have weather apps on my phone. For a while, with my traffic network, we distributed weather data. I had Bob Richards working for me at one point in time. Matter of fact, I had him working for me up until the day he was killed in the plane crash and the whole bit, and was very close to a lot. I knew. What was his name? He was also on Channel 5. I really got into this. Okay, so NOAA is the organization that they're out there in Weldon Spring, right there off of Highway 40 and 94. They're back in the, matter of fact, I think they were the original inhabitant of the, what do they call that? The Missouri Technical, whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Tech Development Corporation.
Right. Back there, you get off of Highway 40 right there. They got their own exit now. Okay, so having said that, I heard this on the air the other day. I thought to myself, this can't be right, okay? One of the things we learned in meteorology school is there is this thing called the USHCN, and that stands for United States Historical Climatology Network, okay? And what these are essentially 1,218 reporting stations around the country. And back in the day, a lot of these stations were manually run where you had to have a meteorologist go out and check the rain gauge and check the barometer and stuff like that. Now it's pretty much all computerized, and it reports back to central locations and puts it out on the internet through the websites and stuff like that. Okay, here's the interesting thing. The network hit its peak in 1957, and it had a maximum of 1,218 stations in 1957. But after 1990, the number of active stations began declining due to aging equipment and personnel requirements. In other words, they didn't replace the equipment and they didn't hire new people. Now, of the 1,218 reporting sites, 30% of those don't exist anymore. But the crazy thing about it is, if you go and look at the USHCN data, it still shows 1,218 data points. Now, what's interesting about this is, think about this for a minute. There's a guy, and I guess he's still in the military. His name is Lieutenant Colonel John Shuwook, and he's a certified consulting meteorologist. He says, quote, NOAA fabricates temperature data for more than 30% of the 1,218 USHCN reporting stations that no longer exist. They just essentially throw data against the wall, and
they make it up. Right?
They make it up. Yeah. He calls.
So now I'm not. I hate to be jaded here, Brad, but I'm not the least bit surprised by that.
Oh, you're not?
Oh no, absolutely not.
Okay, so what they're doing is they're using historical data for like 30%, okay, 30% of, let's just round it up, 1,200. 1,200, that would be what? 30% would be a third, almost a third. So in other words, what?
Yeah, 400.
400 stations don't exist anymore?
Yeah, they're just making it up.
They're just making up 400 stations?
And so my bias here is that in 2013, Monsanto bought a company called the Climate Corporation, Brad.
Right.
That was entirely based on taking a few data points and then saying, well, based on how the weather is a few miles away, we guess that it's probably rain. It's, you know what? It's super cloudy in Ellisville, so it's probably raining in Chesterfield. So you know what? And people say, cool, AI. And today you just add AI to everything, and people think it's perfect. I'm not the least bit surprised by that, Brad.
Okay, let me go a little bit further in this article. Jamal Munshi, he's an emeritus professor of California's Sonoma State University, wrote in a 2017 paper that because many of the stations in the U.S. HCN and their data date back to the 1800s, they've been, quote, widely used in the study of global warming. So in other words, we're going back to the 1800s. There are data points that, once again, were recorded in the 1800s that are not recorded anymore, but they're just estimated. They're just make-up thing. He says, the fear of anthropogenic global warming has generated a great interest in temperature trends such that even minute changes in the temperature record are scrutinized, and controversial implications for the effects on the climate, extreme weather, and sea level rise are weighed against the cost of reducing emissions as a way of moderating these changes. Energy and development policy around the world are impacted by these evaluations. And Mr. Suchuk, who is Lieutenant Colonel, he said the USHCN data is the only long-term historical temperature data the United States has. He says, in these days of apparent climate crisis, you would think that maintaining actual temperature reporting stations would be a top priority, but instead, manufacturing data for hundreds of non-existing stations. This is a bizarre way of monitoring a climate claimed to be an existential threat. Okay, once again, they're making up data for, what we say, 400 points? And and so, but isn't that the idea, though, Brad? You get the answer you want, which is the climate is getting hotter every year, and we're losing more and more biodiversity. Okay,
and then you come up with a formula that gives you that output.
Once again, I go back to my meteorological training, and you can go on the website and you can find all this information very easily. The two hottest decades in St. Louis. Do you remember what they were? We talked about this before. Remember what they are?
I don't remember, no.
The 1930s and the 1950s. Matter of fact, the highest temperature ever recorded in the city of St. Louis, or for St. Louis, which is the airport, was in 1954. I think it was 114. Okay, we have not come close to 114 in decades. And if you go back in history, you know that during the 30s, not only do we have the Great Depression, we had the Dust Bowl, which was climatological catastrophe some people say, well, it's all because of man, it's all because of the farming, that they didn't do proper farming techniques, they had a soil erosion problems, blah, 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 blah. Okay, once again, in St. Louis, the two hottest decades were essentially almost, 70 years ago, the 50s, and 90 years ago, the 30s. And people talk about, now, here's the other interesting thing about this is, Bob Richards used to talk about this all the time, and also Dave Murray talks about this. Have you ever heard him talk about what he calls the climate dome or the heat domes of like the city of St. Louis?
Over a city, yeah, where the heat stays contained there?
Right, because of the fact that what happens is if you go back hundreds of years, when there, like let's go back 500 years, when there was no downtown St. Louis and it was all essentially grassland or trees or stuff like that, when the sun came up, it heated up the trees and heated up the grass, and grass grew and the trees grew and the flowers grew and blah, 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 blah. And when the sun went down, the trees did not, for the most part, did not contain that heat and not keep that heat in. Well, nowadays, when you have an area like downtown St. Louis, you don't find too many trees and you don't find hardly any grass. It's all pavement and all buildings. And so, in other words, what happens is as the buildings heat up during the day, when the sun goes down, the temperatures don't go down right away. The temperatures stay elevated because of the fact that everything is hot. The buildings are hot.
It retains the heat.
It retains the heat, okay? So in other words, once upon a time, and still the official temperatures and the official weather data is still recorded at the airport. And why is that? Let's go back in history. Because for years and years and years, the reason that you have had the meteorologist at the airport is because they would give the weather data to the pilots. In the old days, before there was apps and smartphones and things like that, the Weather Bureau was at the airport, and the pilots would physically walk into the Weather Bureau people and say, "Hey, we're flying to Chicago. What's the weather like?" And the meteorologist was like, "Well, you're going to hit some rain." There was no radar. There was none of that stuff. Go back in your history and go back and look at all the crazy, weird things that happened during World War II, especially around D-Day, because of the fact that they wanted to have perfect weather for D-Day. They didn't want to have rain or clouds or stuff like that because they had the planes that had to fly and bomb France, for ahead of the invasion on the Omaha beaches and the other beaches.
Okay.
But they didn't have radar. They didn't have anything. They essentially had, and back in the day, when the most sophisticated thing was they had weather balloons where they would send these balloons up in the air, literally like with a barometer on them and stuff like that. And then they would come back down and so things have gotten much more sophisticated. But the readings, almost every place in the country, they're still taken at the airport. Now, let's go back, 80, 90 years. Lambert Airport was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around it. It was like in no man's land, okay? Now, go out to Lambert, guess what? Everything's built around it. Well, at least until they tore out Bridgeton, but Bridgeton's gone. But once again, it's a heat dome because back in the day, if you go back in the day to some of these airports, the runways were grass. Okay, now we have 4 big runways that heat up. And not only that, matter of fact, there's a picture a friend of mine sent me, which is pretty funny, of, I can't remember what airport this is at, but one of these USHCN reporting things that takes the temperature is out at the airport, and it's been in the same spot for 80 or 90 years. The only problem was that it's close to one of the runways, and the picture is a jet which is turning, and at that particular point, the jet blast is going at this temperature sensing station. So guess what? Guess what do you think that temperature sensing station is
super
sensing?
Hot.
It's showing it's super hot because it's catching all the exhaust from the jets. And once again, is the climate changing? Yes, but guess what? It changes every day. If it were the same, we wouldn't need the Bob Richards of the world or the meteorologist world,
Yeah.
and they get the forecast wrong most of the time anyway, not most of the time, but a lot of times. And once again, if you go back, I say this all the time, people, climate change. Drive 270, drive that stretch going south or north in 270 between 44 and Doherty Ferry, where you're in the rocks. Those rocks are, if you look at where they carved the highway through those rocks are sedimentary rocks. Guess what that term sedimentary means? For the most part, it means that once upon a time, water deposited those layers of rocks there. Okay, now, look at where those rocks are and look at where the Merrimack River is. I would be willing to bet that there's probably 150, 250 feet difference between the water level and the Merrimack River and the rocks along 270 right there between 44 and Doherty Ferry. Get what I'm saying, John?
I do, yeah.
So once upon a time, maybe eons ago, billions of years ago, there was water that covered all of the St. Louis area. The entire St. Louis area was covered with water. Okay? Were there SUVs out there killing the climate? Were there planes killing the climate? Were there
there were a lot of white women in West County in line at Starbucks, Brad. How do you think they got their Starbucks? They were in the SUV. Brad, when folks are listening to segment C at 1.5 speed via YouTube, to summarize what you're saying is we need more Chinese weather balloons.
Because
wasn't that your takeaway?
You know why that is, don't you?
I don't know.
We are National Public Radio, NPR, where the news is what we say is the news.
That's why. Because
and they got all of our modern secrets, Brad. Not just ancient Chinese secrets, but the Chinese weather balloons get all of our modern American secrets.
Ancient Chinese secret.
Okay. We got to get out of here. We've done enough damage for the day.
We'll see you guys on Tuesday.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?